Navigating stitches around corners can be a little bit tricky. Now, with the single line input method video, we looked at some properties that allow for the changing of how it navigates those corners. What do you do if that's not the tool you're using? How do you get around corners? Let's look at a few methods. Here I just have some artwork of a typical corner. It may not be at this angle, but how do I navigate around this? And if I just digitize those outside edges, so here I'm using a column 2. If I just digitize those outside edges, those inside stitches, that can get a little bit scary. If I put it in 3D, you can even see I've exceeded what would become from a satin stitch to a fill, and I'm sinking lots of stitches into a tiny space, and that's probably going to pucker my fabric, and that's just not a good look. So what do you do? How do you navigate it? How do you deal with that? One option is, of course, to cap it. And so to cap it, you have, I'm going to grab a vector line to kind of draw across here real quick. You have kind of all your stitches about the same stitch direction throughout the form. So you kind of start it off in pieces. And so you digitize with, I'm going to move this down here so that we have a nice kind of place to break it. You digitize with a leg, and then the cap, and then a leg again. So these I just have, let's change these colors. Let's change these to green. So the green I'm using as stitch direction, and the blue I'm using as a place to break my element. So I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to start up one way. I'm using a column 2. It doesn't matter if you use a column 2 or a column 1. If you use a complex fill, this actually gets a little bit easier because you can do it all in one piece. And then you would travel up, or I guess you could just move your entry point of your next piece. So I'm going to come back down. I'm going to hit kind of that line. If you need to overlap a little bit, you may need to do that. It depends on the fabric. It depends on your application. I do need to move this down. The other thing, when you come to a point like this, you may need to angle your stitches to kind of get to something closer to a point. If you just go straight to a point, you'll have really short stitches, and well, it's going to be a thread break, or it could be a thread break. It may just sink down into the fabric and you don't see it. So for a cap, you do it in essentially 3 pieces. You may have a travel in there, you may move your entry point, but it looks more like this, where you do one leg, then the cap, then the other leg. If you're starting to sink stitches within the form, you could choose to extend these legs to where that won't happen. Have just a touch of overlap in that middle section, and shorten the cap so that you always end up with satins. That would be an option. That's kind of an in-between option of a cap and a miter. A miter is another way that you could consider doing this, and it has kind of similar aspects to the cap, except for that you almost bisect that angle. And this you would typically do in 2 pieces. So you would come up, on one side, and I would give myself a little bit of overlap. So I would do something like this. And I try to give myself a stitch direction that will blend into the next element. You don't typically do this in 3D. And then the piece that's sewing on top, I try to come right down that middle. And then down the other side. And so that has a look like that, where you kind of have a seam running down that corner. So with the single line, it has a property that does this. Sorry, there's a cap. If you go into properties, the single line property would be corners. And they kick in at different angles. So cap would be what that pink is doing, right? Where it's solid till the end. Miter, style 1 is where it's got that seam running down the middle. So it's like the light blue that we just did. And then the other option is a miter style 2, which looks really funny as a satin, but it's really meant for something like a tackle or a zigzag, where it's meant to mimic the style of a turn that you would have with a normal sewing machine around the edge of tackle twill letters, where it would zigzag up. You'd put the needle down, lift the presser foot, rotate, put the presser foot back down, and start sewing in the opposite direction so it doesn't taper. And for that, it's easier for me if I start on the inside, but you would go up pretty much till you touch the edge. And then that's one element, and then the other element comes back down, and starting that back over, just kind of squared off corners. So let's make that orange, and let's make that a tackle stitch, since that's what it would most likely be. And so that would be a miter style 2 if you were looking in the single line properties. Now there is another option, there is another way to do this, and that is not in properties, but it's how you might choose to do something. You might choose to extend this line. So this is, we're drawing things out on paper, helps, or adding vector lines if you've got them to your artwork is helpful. This is kind of a different way of doing that. Miter, where you get past where you were, I tend to kind of come in a bit depending on how much room I have. And then let me take this out of 3D. And then I come to the end, and I would need to move my entry point if I was doing this so that it generates a travel. Otherwise, you could use a walk stitch in between to travel. But you come back down, kind of create like a mini cap plus an overlap. Let's change this to a purple. And it gives it a different look even yet, but it is handy for smaller elements where you need to get in there and get out, and it's just kind of a restart of that corner. Now I said all this is a little bit easier if you are doing things with a fill, with a complex fill. With a unifill input method, it's a lot easier because you can just trace around those elements. I don't have a hole. Now, if you wanted to input a splice, you could. Let's look at the cap first. So I'm going to say no, entry, exit. Let's do stitch direction here. And if I change this to satin, it's already taking care of that cap for me. So we did caps in pink. Let's go ahead and put that back up here. So that's pretty slick. If I wanted to do a miter style one like this one, let's make that blue, we would need to insert a splice, and that splice would go pretty much from here to here. That takes care of that. Now my stitch directions, if I wanted them to have full stitches on the bottom, I would need to right click and go across those bottom pieces and give each of these their own. And I can fill out that stitch direction down here as well. Okay, next, let's grab this pink one and let's look at miter style 2. So this one, let's make it a zigzag. Now the trouble with this one is, one, we cut it off early, and two, I don't need this piece. And I want the stitches to overlap. I don't have a good way to do that, so I'm going to split this element so that there I have the first piece, and then with this piece, I just need to bring this up. And then I need to move my exit point to the end so that it zigzags up and zigzags back. Now when I split that, it kept all the old pieces, so we had to move that entry and exit point. So you can do that. We should make that orange. Okay. And then let's do this one more time with that purple kind of miter. So I'm going to move this over and we're going to look at doing it this way. And again, splice is what we need for that. Let's drag this down. When I put that splice in, I need to shorten these stitch directions so that they each have one in a segment. Now this, let's take this out of 3D and look at it for a second. This, we have a nice overlap here. Here, not so much. We don't have the overlap that we want. If I need to break this into pieces, I can right click, go to operations and go to break object, and it will break it on that splice. So then I've got one piece that I have the way that I want it. The other piece, I just need to increase that overlap a little bit. And now I have the same effect as that purple miter below it. With sharp corners, there are lots of ways to navigate those stitches around and get you a smooth, nice sew out for that corner. It's a little bit of creativity and a little bit of digitizer's choice which kind of corner you want to use.